Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. It is time for another Q&A. And I wanted to start actually by pointing out that after many years of people requesting and then several months of working to get it arranged, we finally have shirts. So if you take a look at the link below, that will take you to the shop where you can get not just shirts, but hoodies, backpacks, a couple other cool things, both for Forgotten Weapons and also for in-range TV, if you're interested in those. This particular one is kind of a Puckle Gun limited edition shirt. It's still there in the shop as of when I'm recording this, but it will be disappearing at some point. I don't know exactly when. There are a number, the stuff with just the standard basic logos will be always available, but some of the really cool stuff like this will come and go, be limited edition stuff. So if you are one of those people who has been really excited and asking me to get some of that available, it now is. So check the link in the description below. All right, we will start with B.R. Waldo, who asks, do you have a Forgotten Weapons reading list that you would be willing to share with us? Well, sort of. Kind of yes, kind of not really. I get a lot of questions about, what book should I get about guns? And the answer is, I don't really know. There are one or two really good general purpose books that I often recommend. Handguns of the World by Edward Ezell is one in particular. It's cheap, it covers a remarkable amount of technical detail while also being an interesting historical, putting things in historical context. And best of all, that book is available really, really cheap most of the time. So I usually recommend that, but beyond that, it becomes a question of, well, what are you interested in? And the books that I have are almost all on pretty specific subjects. So if you want to know, what book should I get on the M1 Garand? Okay, we can give you some answers for that. Or is there a good reference book on Argentinian Mausers? Yes, there is. Or Argentine Mausers, sorry. Yeah, there is. And I can tell you about that book. But if it's just, well, I'm interested in guns, then it's really hard to say. Now, one thing that I do have going, I'm going to be doing, I have been doing, and I will continue to do more book reviews. We did a lot of those early on, and people enjoy them. And it seems like there are a lot of new books coming out that are interesting and valuable. I think the internet is helping in large part with a lot of that. But there will be a more regular book review series going. And also on the website, ForgottenWeapons.com, because there is a website behind this whole thing, not just a YouTube channel. At the very bottom of the page, one of the things that I'm keeping at the bottom is a note of what am I currently reading. And that's usually going to be something that's not strictly technical. At the moment I'm recording this, it's actually a book on General de Gaulle in France, political history of de Gaulle. So if you're interested in what am I reading for general educational content, take a look at the very bottom of ForgottenWeapons.com. And when I finish one book and switch to another, I'll go ahead and change the link in the image down there. D. Griggs says, I recently bought a 1916 SMLE in great condition. Is it normal for the rifles to have such a bad trigger? Well, yeah, pretty much is. I found with a lot of military surplus stuff, especially things as old as World War II, World War I, there's really a lot of variability. You'll get sometimes pretty decent triggers. You'll get sometimes pretty terrible triggers. That depends a lot on the manufacturer, how the gun has worn, whether or not anyone has done any work, pro or con, to that gun in the decade since it was in the military. It is possible to replace parts and get a better trigger pull. It's possible to replace parts and get a worse trigger pull. If you just had something that broke at some point and someone just swapped in a new part, then of course, if that happens after a gun's been surplus, the military has no control over, a quality assessment on the trigger pull. A lot of these guns were not made to have really, really nice triggers like a lot of us are used to today. So in short, yeah, even guns that are renowned for being quite accurate, things like Finnish Mosin Nagants, you'll still get a fair number of them with pretty awful trigger pulls. And I think that was just kind of par for the course most of the time. Next up, Alan asks, can you suggest any underappreciated or undervalued firearms for a beginning collector? Well, so the tricky part here is if you want something that you can have underpriced and you can have underappreciated, but sometimes it's difficult to get both. Underpriced will often happen when a gun is being imported. So we saw this a couple of years ago with a bunch of the little like Polish 32 caliber pistols that came in, and Czech .32 caliber pistols. A whole bunch of these things come in a giant batch from one of the big importers, someone like Century, and they're sold at retail, both by Century and by all of its distributors. And so that kind of pushes the price down because this is something that's simply available and there's lots of them. And as a result, you get these pistols for about $200. And then what happens is as those dry up, this was one big import batch that came in and they sell out. And as they get scarcer and scarcer on the retail market, the price starts to go up a little bit. Once they're completely sold out, then it kind of becomes a supply and demand thing. There are a lot of people who, and I include myself in this group, I ought to know better, but I often don't. A lot of people who ignore the guns when they come in a big batch because it's like, oh, well, they're cheap. They can't be all that good. They'll always be there. I don't really want to spend $200 on that right now, but maybe next month. And then 6 months later, you come back to it and you're like, oh, what about those little 32s? And go and look, and now they're gone. And now they're, selling on Gunbroker and auction pages and classified ad pages for like $300, and things just kind of climb from there. So at that point, you're looking at a gun that it was underpriced, and then it goes to being underappreciated maybe, but now the prices are going up because they're less available. The trick, I think, to finding something that's both cheap and cool is to look for stuff that was imported in a big batch, but was imported long enough ago that people don't really remember it anymore and aren't that interested in it. So a classic example would probably be, sorry Italy, Italian surplus firearms, Carcanos or Carcanos. There are a bunch of different variations, and I think they're kind of interesting. I'm going to be doing a 2-gun match with an M38 Carcano, hopefully coming up shortly in the future. We'll have to see exactly when we can schedule that one in. But I think they're better guns than people give them credit for. Now, there are going to be issues with a lot of things. If you're getting it, if it's cheap and cool, there's probably something else that's keeping it from being really well appreciated or keeping the price down. And with Carcanos, that's usually ammunition. The 7.35 is very difficult to get. The 6.5 is easier now than it used to be. But a lot of these Carcanos were imported in the 50s and 60s and maybe 70s and 80s. And they got this really horrible reputation in part because of the ammunition, in part because just general World War I and World War II folklore, the Italians don't have that good of a reputation. But I think they're interesting guns. I have a handful of them myself, and I think that might be an interesting place to start if you're just looking for something that is collectible and also affordable and interesting. Japanese guns used to fall into that category as well. In fact, actually Japanese and French as well, although they've both been kind of making a comeback. People, largely I expect thanks to the internet, people are starting to appreciate both the Japanese and the French arms more and more. Arashi asks, was the myriad of early semi-automatic pistol designs a result of true experimentation and refinement, or mostly the need to avoid existing patents? I think really the answer is both. You had elements of each. There were some designers, like John Browning, who came up with some pretty good ideas and patented everything they could come up with. In 1897, Browning patented not 1, not 2, but 4 different ways to operate a semi-automatic pistol. And, for example, one of those was basically a gas, not a gas trap, but like a gas hammer designed for a pistol, similar to the Colt 1895 machine gun, which turns out to have been a terrible way to operate a pistol. And I don't believe they might have done a prototype, but never went past prototype status. No one really had to worry about avoiding that patent. That was just, maybe that'll work. There's an idea. Just in case, I'll patent it so that I have a monopoly on that idea of mine if I decide that it is something that I want to follow that does work well. At the same time, because of things like that, you'll get patents taken out on ideas that are really terrible ideas. And of course, no one was hurting to try and get around that particular patent of Browning's. So early on, people really didn't know what was going to work and what wasn't. And it's more than just the operating system. You have a lot of other elements in there, like do we need extractors? The early Bergmann pistols didn't have extractor rims on the ammunition or extractors in the bolt face because, maybe we don't actually need that. The gun seems to work without it. A lot of little elements like that, which are also patentable things. There are a lot of features beyond just the gross operating mechanism that got patented. And especially in that area, you get throw it all at the wall and see what sticks. I want to take a minute here to also mention an email I got from a viewer named John, who appears to have watched a few too many Forgotten Weapons videos and decided to quit his job and start up a shooting educational historical experience sort of thing called Belt and Holster, out of Jackson, Wyoming. And the idea being basically a the impression I get is kind of like the machine gun rental places that you see popping up in various places, except focused instead on the historical Old West experience and allowing people who may not own the guns or have ever fired any guns, or maybe people who are into tactical black rifles, to get an actual hands-on experience for shooting Old West cowboy era guns, lever guns, shotguns, revolvers, the works. And it's something that he is trying to start on his own entrepreneurially, which I think is a fantastic job, fantastic idea. I'd like to promote that sort of thing amongst anyone who has the wherewithal to try and make it happen. And he's doing a lot of his funding by running a t-shirt campaign, not promising anything other than a cool t-shirt and or belt. And so he sent me one of these shirts, and I think it's cool. If you guys are interested, if you like the design of the shirt, check it out. It would help fund a cool endeavor that I think has the potential to really be a beneficial thing for firearms history, firearms culture, and helping to bring new people in to understand and experience what it is that we think is so cool about guns. So thanks to John. Good luck to you. I really hope it succeeds, and I hope some of the other folks watching end up being your customers in the future. Now, on to our next question. Bob G says, considering that all prior attempts at direct gas impingement systems failed rather spectacularly, why did Stoner adopt that system, and why did the US military accept it? Well, I think there's a false premise in the question. Previous attempts at direct gas impingement actually were fairly successful. There are really only kind of two main ones. The Swedish Ljungman, which was a reasonably successful gun and developed in a remarkably short period of time. Of course, Sweden didn't really get into a significant major conflict, military conflict with those rifles the way a lot of other countries did, say World War II. So there wasn't a lot of military combat field use of the Ljungman, although it was a good enough design that it did get exported out to Egypt. They decided to manufacture them under license, as in both 7.62x39 as the Rashid and an 8 Mauser as the Hakim rifle. But the Ljungman was a good gun, and it is straight direct gas blowback, or direct gas impingement. The other one, of course, is the whole French series. The French started with the MAS 1940, and then the 1944, which was actually put into production, quickly revised as the MAS 49, which worked pretty well, and they decided, well, we can lighten this, make it a little handier, turned into the 49/56. All of those are also pure direct gas impingement, and they work extremely well. So I would call direct gas impingement a system that is not hugely common, but certainly not one that you could ever reasonably call disastrous or unsuccessful. Now, in the AR-15, in the Stoner system, you actually don't have direct gas impingement. What you have is a gas piston that is built into the bolt and bolt carrier, where that intersection where the bolt fits into the bolt carrier, that is the gas piston. What people refer to as the direct gas impingement part is simply a very long gas tube taking gas from out here on the barrel, routing it down into the bolt carrier where it operates the piston. Now, it is somewhat interesting, thinking about it now, that nobody else has really tried to replicate that system, where you have the gas piston built into the bolt carrier assembly. Patents are all long expired. There's no reason anyone couldn't take on that design, but I think probably the most reasonable explanation for why they haven't is that the AR-15 really does that system quite well. And if you want to use that system, I'm not sure there's much reason to redesign the wheel instead of just work from the AR to begin with. Well-proven examples of the AR-15 exist in both small intermediate calibers, 5.56, and large full-power rifle calibers, like 308. So what's the advantage in starting from scratch? Daniel K. says, the Silencer Co. Osprey and Salvo-12 are offset. Those are both suppressors from Silencer Co. And when he says offset, he means that the bore of the gun is not located in the direct center of the suppressor. I'd like to hear from Ian as well, given why... So that's not really a question, but it is a statement of unusual fact. I'd like to hear from Ian as well, given how they seem to be the only ones making cans that way. Maybe it's easier to manufacture a simple tube and circular baffles. That is true. I'm sure it is a little bit less expensive to make just a plain concentric suppressor. The other reason, I think, is that the suppressor market is a pretty tight one. There's not that much that you can judge a suppressor by. Basically, you've got weight, size, and decibel reduction. And both because of the NFA and because decibel reduction is something that's in some ways really kind of hard to get a good feel for. If I say 134 decibels, to most people who aren't deeply into suppressors, that doesn't really mean a whole lot. And even the people who are deeply into suppressors are going to hear a number like that, and then they're going to immediately say, give us context. Is that at the muzzle? Is it several feet back from the muzzle? Is it several feet out from the ejection port? Or is it on the non-ejection port side of the gun? Is it ahead or behind of the muzzle? There are a lot of details here that will influence exactly what the noise, the sound of a firearm or sound of a suppressed firearm actually technically is. What makes that little decibel number? And as a result, because let's be honest, nobody in the suppressor buying market really has that much context for this stuff. A lot of times it's going to come down to, well, that one's got the best number listed on their website. And when you have offset suppressors, they're not going to be quite as efficient at reducing sound as a perfectly symmetrical one. Because if the bore's up here, you're going to get less gas coming down into this bottom area. If you took the same volume and moved it so the bore was right in the center, you would get slightly more efficient reduction of sound energy. So while in the real world, I don't think that really matters. Those differences are going to be pretty minute. But when you're in this situation of a lot of your customer base is making their decision based on one little ideal number on a website, all of a sudden, well, do we really want to make it offset and lose a substantial portion of our customer base that's not going to recognize how important that number is or the other benefits they get from an offset suppressor, which, by the way, are things like you don't necessarily need brand new sights if the suppressor's offset and you can see your target through your sights over the top of the suppressor. When Hiram Maxim Jr. first marketed firearm silencers, as he called them, they were offset, and that was so you didn't need to mess with sights. You just thread the thing on and go about your shooting. He didn't have a lot of competition to worry about, and I think at that point in the development, it was a lot more beneficial to people to have it just slightly louder, but not have to modify their firearm in order to use the suppressor. That being said, I will give you this caveat that I am not a suppressor expert. Certainly wouldn't claim to be, am not, and so I may be missing other details that are relevant. I don't think so, but it is absolutely a possibility. So if you're really interested in this subject, I would suggest look for some better resources than me. Next up, Alexander N. says, Ian, can you tell us why so many countries used, and I think the Brits just recently adopted a new model, single-shot 22 long rifle, 22 LR rifles as their military training weapons? It doesn't make sense to me to train your recruits with a single-shot rifle if your standard military rifle is a repeating one with a magazine that holds at least 5 rounds. There are very few 22 caliber military training rifles that use magazines. Why is that? I think what you're getting at here is cost and complexity, both of design and of the actual training process. When you're training with a 22 rimfire rifle, you're not training tactics as a general rule, the way militaries handle this. What you're doing is training very basic marksmanship principles. So how do we safely handle the weapon and not just be randomly pointing it at people? Trigger control, sight alignment, proper positioning. So if you're shooting prone, where do you put your hands? Where do you put your elbows? How do you lie on the ground? If you're shooting standing, same questions. Do you lean forward? Do you lean back? Do you face onto the target? Do you blade off from the target? These are the very fundamental issues that you're trying to train, and it's best to do that with a weapon that takes recoil and noise and blast out of the equation, because those things only make that fundamental practice harder. So that's why they're going to go to a 22 caliber rimfire cartridge. It's, in comparison, very quiet. It's very cheap compared to centerfire ammunition. It's going to be, well, there's no recoil that will make brand new shooters, brand new recruits who possibly have never handled a gun before in their lives. Recoil makes them recoil averse, and you start developing flinches. That's not a problem with 22 rimfire. So those are a lot of reasons to go with the rimfire, and having single shot rifles over magazine rifles kind of is in the same vein. For all that, you'd want single shot rifles for all the same reasons. If you have magazine fed rifles, now you do have an additional potential safety issue in that you don't necessarily know how many rounds are in anyone's magazine, and if they're brand new recruits, probably they don't either. You're going to have the extra complexity of paying for magazines, which probably isn't that big a deal, but magazines are generally the most common source of malfunctions in firearms. And so where if you're training with single shots, all you have to worry about is put a cartridge in the gun. If you have magazines, all of a sudden now, are people damaging magazines? Are bad magazines causing malfunctions, which people are then trying to remediate, which takes away from the ability to train the things that you're actually trying to get out of this training session. So single shot guns are going to be cheaper, and they're going to be easier to train the things that you're trying to train with rimfire. Now, when you go to the point where you're wanting to train for things like shot recovery, follow-up shots, moving while you're shooting, kind of advanced level stuff, tactics, then you're going to go to basically more of your straight issue rifle. And that's when it helps to have magazines and repeating shots. All right, moving on to the other side of the sheet here. Robert D says, why did 30 rounds become the de facto standard magazine capacity in assault rifles? Well, I'd say the direct answer is because 30 rounds is what became standard in the AR-15 and the AK-47. Outside of those two, 30 isn't really quite doesn't quite have the monopoly that a lot of people expect. But ARs and AKs make up such a huge majority of the assault rifles, the military rifles out there, that it looks like 20 and 30 is the standard. Now, this is also compounded by the fact that the 30-round AR-15 magazine was adopted as NATO standard, and so new rifles that aren't AR-15s are still built around that magazine, and thus that 30-round magazine continues to be the de facto standard. Italy's rifle, the ARX series, uses Stanag AR-15 mags. The SETMI, Spanish SETMI L, used it. A lot of rifles use Stanag magazines. Even guns like the G36 have been adapted to Stanag magazines. However, getting back, before you had the AR and the AK, you had other magazine capacities that were out there. 20 was actually a lot more common than 30. With early rifles, 10 rounds was pretty common. I think you'll always see these be, or virtually always, they will be even numbers, because a lot of what builds into this is ammunition packaging. And so if you were to have, say, a 21 round magazine, now you're trying to package ammunition in 21 round batches, and that just doesn't work well for square boxes. Kind of basic fundamental stuff here, but that's really what comes into play. One interesting one to look at are the magazines from the Swiss Sturmgewehr 57 or PE 57 in civilian guise. Those things use 24 round magazines, and they did it for very good reason. The Swiss bolt action rifles used 6 round magazines. The Swiss machine guns used 30 round magazines. And this was this 7.5 Swiss, so it's a full power cartridge. That 30 round magazine is a bit long and cumbersome for a handheld, a shoulder fired rifle, but 20 rounds isn't a particularly good answer if you're worried about 6 and 30 as your logistical ballparks. If you use a 24 round magazine, now you're looking at you're looking at 4 of your 6 round chargers from the Schmidt-Rubin bolt actions. If everything is a multiple of 6, which 30 rounds is as well, a 30 round mag is now 5 of your 6 round chargers. everything fits in nicely. And in fact, if you look at the Swiss ammo packaging, where they have 480 rounds in a case, broken into 60 round bricks, which are each broken into 12 round packets. Or I'm sorry, 120 round bricks in 12 round packets. So 2 of those packets will fill 1 rifle magazine. 1 of those packets will fill 2 bolt action magazines. 2 of those, or 5 of those will fill 2 machine gun magazines. Everything kind of works out in various multiples. So that's what went into a lot of magazine sizing, I think. There were also 40s. The AR-180s used 40-round magazines. The Russians, or the Soviets, used a 40-round magazine in their light machine gun version of the AK. The RPK used 40s. 25s are out there in some guns. But really, 30 rounds is there because of the AK and the AR. And I think the reason that you get 30 for those is that it's the best balance point between having a lot of ammo and having a gun that's awkward and too long. Much more than 30, and you start getting the magazine is monopoding the gun up higher than you'd really like to be able to get down behind it. So interesting to also point out that when the Soviets went from 7.62 by 39 down to 5.45, the cartridge case got smaller in diameter, the case head, not just the bullet. And they actually went from a 40-round RPK magazine to a 45-round RPK magazine because they were able to put 5 more rounds in the mag. Because that's a smaller diameter cartridge, that gave them about the same length as the previous 40-rounder. So a lot of it's based on that. How low can you get prone with the gun before the magazine becomes an awkward problem? Next up, Luke M. says, why do you think that more militaries didn't adopt straight pull bolt action rifles a la the Schmidt-Rubin 9611 or Schmidt-Rubin K11 or K31 or G11 or any of them? I think the answer is that it's an added complexity and an added cost for something that isn't really that important for militaries when they were building bolt action rifles. In this context, you're looking at a whole unit as working together. This is the bolt action combat rifles weren't really developed on this idea that a single guy is going to be your base unit of shooting. Instead, you're going to have a squad, or with things like volley sights, they're based on having whole companies working together. But if you've got a squad of guys all shooting, the exact time, the split times for each guy to cycle the bolt or to reload as well don't really make that much difference. And straight pull rifles add an extra level of complexity. Basically, all those straight pull rifles are actually rotating bolt guns. The Steyr M95s, the Schmidt-Rubin family, the Ross, they're all rotating bolts. What they've done is add an extra mechanical feature into the bolt carrier or the bolt body so that it does that rotating for you. Where with a typical bolt action turn bolt rifle, you turn the bolt manually. You turn it and then pull it back, push it forward, and turn it down. If you've got a straight bolt, that same thing is happening, but the bolt mechanism is doing it for you. And that means that the bolt mechanism is going to be more complex, more expensive, more prone to malfunction, more prone to dirt or breakage or any of these things that cause problems. So if you're a company like, or a country like Switzerland, where you have a small armed force and kind of the whole idea of the Swiss armed forces is high quality, small numbers. Well, okay, then yeah, you can spend the extra money on better rifles, slightly better rifles, that are a little faster to shoot, and that makes sense. Now, why the Austro-Hungarian Empire went with them, that's kind of a different matter, although I will point out that Mannlicher, who designed the M95, was Austrian. Those were made at Steyr in Austria. There was probably a lot of we'd like to purchase a rifle that was domestically designed. And in 1895, they might not have seen a whole lot of better options than the Steyr M95. At any rate, I think the reason more people didn't do it is the extra complexity. Next up, Jasper W. says, you have talked about the difficulty of resurrecting historic firearms such as the C96 because it would require resurrecting historical manufacturing methods that are no longer practical. Besides 3D printing, could other methods like metal injection molding, casting, or CNC be used if the market would support it? Or should I just plan a trip to the Khyber Pass? I wouldn't recommend a trip to the Khyber Pass to get a good reproduction of an interesting historical gun. I'm sure some of those guys could make them, but honestly, they're not going to make them for the exact same reason that I think most of the industry in the United States isn't going to make them, or anywhere else for that matter. And that reason is that they're just not viable. The problem is there aren't enough people interested in spending the money to get a reproduction in order to allow manufacture on the scale that would allow the price to come down to something where a lot of people are going to be interested. Most times, reproduced guns don't really do all that well. The Luger is a fantastic example. Mauser in the late 60s and 1970s had a deal with Interarms to manufacture brand new Luger pistols, parabellum pistols. And the initial plan was to make 100,000 of the things, and they ended up making something like 6,000. Not all that many in the grand scheme of things, because there just wasn't enough commercial interest in them. And that's for a gun as iconic as the Luger. Now, the balance you always have is how many people are interested, how many are already out there. A C96 broom handle is not that expensive of a gun to go get, or rather, they're expensive, but there are a lot of them out there. And if you were to bring a brand new production one onto the market, you'd have to, you're not allowed by this whole reproduction idea. You're not allowed to dramatically simplify the gun. Let's look at it this way. If you were to make a modern reproduction of, let's say, the Colt 1900, early development version of the 1911, but if you were going to go and make it in the way that makes best sense, from a modern manufacturing point of view, you'd end up with a Glock, because that's exactly what has happened. We've developed this semi-auto pistol design for 117 years now, and we've ended up with the ones that are the most economical and reliable and durable and overall objectively best, and that's going to be the modern pistols that are available today. By going back to the early models, you have to do things in ways that are deliberately inefficient, because that's how they were done back then. And you also have to then make them work reliably, because you will get excoriated in the market if your gun comes onto the market and isn't as reliable as the brand new stuff, which, by the way, is made that way because that's how you have to make it, really, to make it totally reliable. And you then have to be able to offer a reproduction gun at a price point that is competitive with the originals of that gun that are already on the market. We can see some of this, for example, with Colt and their reintroduction of, say, the 1908 Colt Pocket Automatic, which was, they deliberately brought it out at a price point that was higher than the existing original nice Colt 1908 Pocket Automatics. And all they planned to do was basically a series of commemorative guns. They had these as the General Officers Edition pistols. So they had the special marketing tie-in to specific generals and promotional material that went along with that. And they never planned for them to be commonly, widely purchased, widely sold manufactured guns. They just wanted to do a short run to sell them to the people who were interested in paying a premium price to have a brand new gun, which I'm sure the vast majority of them will sit in a box for their entire lives. And they're not even trying to compete against the ones that already exist. That's not a viable, that's not a way that you can really drive a company. If you want to start a company to make reproduction guns, you kind of have to be able to try and sell them to a large number of people. Otherwise, you're going to end up with kind of the limited production things that we see today, where the prices are very high and the production is very low, because there's really just that small number of people who are actually willing to fork out the money for it. Look at the sales of the reproduction semi-auto FG42s. Not a whole lot of them, because the price is quite high at $5,000 or thereabouts. So it's really a very tough spot to put a manufacturer in. People are in some ways demanding the impossible, and that's why these things aren't going to happen. Now, if you had a guaranteed customer for 100,000 reproduction FG42s, that would be different, because then you could actually tool up to make them in an efficient manner. For example, making brand new stamping dies to do it, and you'd be able to spread your research and your engineering and your tooling costs out amongst 100,000 rifles instead of 100 rifles or 1,000 rifles. And that's what makes the big difference. It will be interesting to see how Hill and Mack Gunworks are able to ultimately come through with their Sturmgewehr rifles, because by going in, they did modify the design, and I think in their case, it makes sense. The modifications are actually a lot more historically viable than some people give them credit for. And they've designed that rifle now to be something that can be produced in a modern sense. And then they put their pricing low enough to attract a lot of buyers to hopefully overcome that critical hump in the bell curve of, can we get enough people to buy them so that we can get the price low enough in order to get enough people to buy them. I may have gone on a little bit long there, but hopefully that made sense. All right, Andrew G says, if you were asked to choose the prerequisites for a new military battle rifle trial, what would be your top 5 required features? I'm not sure about features. I'm thinking, what are the things that would be tested for, or what would be the requirements of a newly fielded rifle? And the things that I would look for, I think, are going to be weight. Lighter is always better. Military stuff and kind of everything in general tends to always add features and add weight and bulk up over time. We certainly see that with the AR-15 and kind of across the board with military firearms. So I think weight needs to be stressed. Cutting a couple pounds out of a rifle really does make more of a difference than some people recognize. Certainly for the guys who are dragging that thing all over God knows where. Reliability and durability both. It's important to have a gun that's going to work in field conditions all the time, every time, and when it's being abused. And it's also important to have a gun that not just works, but that the parts don't break on. And these things have to be balanced with weight. Durability and weight in particular are kind of two ends of the same spectrum. If you have a very large weight allowance, well, you can make all the parts a lot bigger than they really need to be, and thus ensure that they're not going to be fragile, they're not going to break, they have a very long service life. On the other hand, if you have to keep the weight of the gun down, you have to reduce the mass of the components, because the weight has to come out of somewhere. And unless you do that very well, that's generally going to lead to shorter service lives on a lot of the parts, simply because you have less mass reinforcing them. So you have to properly balance the durability and the weight of a gun, and of course not sacrifice the reliability in the meantime. It needs to be accurate, but I don't think that's a particularly problematic thing. Modern manufacturing techniques have made things like 1 minute of angle guns kind of the de facto standard, and that's substantially better than you even need for a combat rifle. So I'm not going to put accuracy really high on the list, not because it's not important, but because I don't think it's particularly challenging. That's something where I would expect, by default, don't even bother to come to the trial if you don't have a 2 minute of angle gun. And simplicity is something that I think is going to be, simplicity is going to help everything else in the gun, but it may not be something that people recognize or value for itself. All things being equal, the simplest gun that gets the job done, I think, is going to be the best. It's the complex ones that just always kind of develop problems. Case in point, roller delay blowback guns. They're pretty darn simple, and you know what? They just kind of work really well. And then I would also add optics capability. I think that's something that we need today. Every shoulder rifle, every military shoulder rifle today, there's no good reason not to have some sort of optical sight on it. Optical sights, to me, are the thing that really extends your effective range. I think in general, a military rifle's range is going to be largely limited by the distance at which you can actually see and identify a target. And with iron sights, you know what? 400 yards, guys are really, really tiny with iron sights. If you have the ability for not a huge magnification, but a couple power magnification on every standard service rifle, I think that will dramatically increase the actual effective range of the guns. And of course, that's something that we see being done today. Things like the ACOG being adopted as a standard optic by the US military. All of a sudden now you have 4 power scopes and people can identify targets a lot farther out, and that helps. So none of this stuff ought to be all that surprising or novel, certainly to anyone who's actually going to run a rifle field trial. But I don't know, maybe the people aren't necessarily going to know them all. Those are the things I would go with. Weight, optics mounting capability, simplicity, reliability, and durability. If it came to actual like features of the gun, like Arasaka features, like do we want to have fold down, you know, anti-aircraft sights? I think a lot of that is kind of unnecessary. I think you're better off getting rid of extra features in favor of lighter and simpler. Like, do we want integrated bipods on all the guns? I don't know. That seems to be one of those choices where at the initial adoption they decide not to, and then over time they start adding them here and adding them there, and soon enough everyone's got a bipod bolted on the gun, and then everyone's got a laser bolted on the gun, and everyone's got a white light bolted on the gun, and I don't know. It's a balancing act. What's worth the wait? I think ultimately it's going to come down to mission requirement. What exactly are you doing with the gun is going to drive what exact features the gun needs to have. And when you try and create a universal gun, that's when you start running into problems. The logisticians are always going to try and simplify and reduce the number of different elements that you have, where the tacticians are going to try and increase the number because you want to have guns specifically designed for each independent mission or type of mission. That's probably an unending argument that will never cease. Meriham. If I could only have 3 firearms, what would they be and why? Well, we can start that by assuming if I can only have 3 guns, I'm not collecting guns anymore, because that's hard to do with only 3. So I would want to be looking at them in practical terms instead. And if I were to do that, I would start with, honestly, I would start with an AR-15. In fact, in specifics, I would start with the AR-15 that Carl and I are currently designing over on InRange. And this isn't anything posted publicly right now. This is a design that Carl came up with the idea, and we've been toying with the exact details, getting parts together and putting a pair of guns together, one for him and one for me. And we're going to do some video on exactly the question being, what would be the best AR-15 in your minds? And I think we have an interesting answer to that. That AR-15 would be one of my 3 guns. One of them I would want to be a pistol. What pistol is kind of an interesting question. Until not that long ago, I would have, I don't know, whatever, just kind of some modern 9mm thing. After having gone to SHOT Show, I think my choice would honestly actually be a Hudson H9, assuming that the production guns are everything that we're expecting them to be. I think that really kind of is a fantastic balance of being able to safely and effectively carry. It's got 9mm, which is the caliber I would want. The ammo's cheap, recoil is light, it's effective with the right bullets. I think 9mm is a great handgun caliber. The Hudson has a fantastic trigger pull. It's a gun that as it currently stands, as I've seen the prototypes, and as I expect from the production models, which of course aren't out there yet, it's a gun that does excellent duty both as a competition gun, a carry gun, a home gun, and even a target gun. So I think that would be an excellent one-size-fits-all handgun for me. So I take the Hudson, the AR, and then for the third one, I would go with a PKM, because if I can only have 3 guns and I get to have any 3 guns, I kind of want a nice heavy machine gun or a nice machine gun. And the PKM, as far as I can tell, is kind of the best compromise overall design of belt-fed machine gun that's out there. It's not that heavy. It's controllable to shoot. It's reliable. It's durable. You know what? It kind of meets all those requirements that I just talked about, with kind of the exception of optics mounting. But okay, I'll accept that. PKM's a pretty nice gun, I think. I'd probably go with that. So a Hudson, an AR of my own specific arranging, which we'll get to over on InRange TV, and a PKM. Jacob S. says, tell me the story on how you found your way onto a match shooting team and a little about your path to the Forgotten Weapons project. I want to know some Ian history. Okay, we can talk about that for a minute. I went to school at Purdue University. I was at the time I was working on a degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering, and Purdue was, I believe, like the number 3 school in the country for that. That's what I was looking for, so I applied like to the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, something like that. Got accepted by Purdue, went there, was looking for stuff to do on campus, and lo and behold, they had a shooting team. So, in fact, what was cool about Purdue at that point, and I assume this is still true, although it may have changed, I haven't really kept up, is they actually had a shooting range right smack in the middle of campus. There was an old National Guard building that had, it's huge, it was like a 60-lane indoor shooting range that kind of converted into a big open gym space when not being used as a shooting facility, but big steel backstops, and we could shoot 22 long rifle in there all day long. So it was a very convenient thing to do. I didn't have to drive to the range or to the club. We met once a week, I believe, practice sessions, and store your guns there in the armory, and it was really cool. They had a rifle team and a pistol team. And why did I get into pistol instead of rifle? Honestly, I think at the time it was largely because the pistol was more interesting to me. The pistol was standard collegiate bullseye. So you had timed fire, slow fire, timed fire, rapid fire, all built together as one course of fire. And then there was also a free pistol portion. Free pistol is typically done with often single shot guns, and it is really demanding accuracy-centric shooting. And then the other course of fire is done with semi-automatic guns because you need a magazine for rapid fire. And rapid fire, by the way, was 10 shots in 60 seconds, I believe. I'm a little fuzzy. I haven't shot this discipline in like 15 years now. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. It was easily accessible. We weren't a particularly good team. We didn't have all that much of a budget, so we were shooting Smith & Wesson 41s, which are good pistols, but they're not really serious competitive quality pistols. And we were using them as our free pistol guns as well, which was not a good solution. But I was on that team for 3 years. I held some officers' positions in the club structure as well. It was a lot of fun. And I think it was an excellent foundation to go on for other types of shooting. I think doesn't have to be bullseye pistol, but I think the marksmanship-centric sports like NRA high power, like bullseye pistol, bullseye rifle, honestly, I think those are some of the best initial shooting disciplines to get into, because the fundamentals that you have to learn to do well in those disciplines will transfer over into everything else, and they will make you better at any other shooting discipline. No matter how high speed, low drag it is, the better your fundamentals, the better you will be overall. So that's what got me into shooting at school. Forgotten Weapons itself was really kind of a thing of, after I got out of school, I did a few various jobs here and there, and I'd been into firearms this whole time, but I ran into a couple friends I started hanging out with who were fairly advanced collectors in their own right, and that got me access to some really interesting guns in some collections. And that's when I get interested in a subject, I kind of tend to get interested in it to a fault. So the weirder stuff, as I got to look at weird guns, then I got really interested in weirder guns, and the rabbit hole just kind of kept going. I've talked before about why I started the website, and that was, in a nutshell, it was a friend of a friend had access to technical drawings and manuals for all 4 versions of the Pedersen device, Enfield, Springfield, Lebel, and Mosin Nagant, 3 of which are basically unavailable anymore. He had all this information. He died. His family didn't know what it was, and they just threw it away, and we will probably never find that stuff again. I suspect those copies he had were the last remaining ones in existence. And when that happened, a friend and I kind of came to the conclusion that, maybe we could do something to archive some of this material. And that led to ForgottenWeapons.com. Enough about me. How about Aaron M's question? Has there ever been a successful gas-operated pistol? Yes, a couple, but not many. The most common one is the IMI Desert Eagle. Some of the other really huge, overpowered semi-auto pistols, like the Wildie, have been gas-operated, and that kind of gets at why there aren't more of them. we typically have recoil-operated pistols and gas-operated rifles. And the reason for that is you tend to have the bolt and barrel mechanism of a pistol is fairly compact and light, whereas on a rifle, it's fairly bulky and heavy. And having a recoil mechanism on a rifle means you're moving a lot of stuff back and forth. Those exist. Guns like, well, there's a lot of short recoil ones. A lot of machine guns are short recoil. Long recoil guns like the Remington Model 8 or the Browning Auto 5. There's a lot of stuff moving around, and that's not necessarily a good engineering solution. If you can instead tap some gas and have a small piston that concentrates the force that you want to use exactly where you want to use it, instead of moving a lot of extraneous material around, that's a more elegant design, and that tends to work better. However, when you get into a pistol, everything's smaller. If you want a gas-operated pistol, you're going to have a very small piston. You're going to have a very short gas tube. Nothing's moving very far. And at that point, your parts are going to tend to be small and fragile, when instead you could just have a recoil-operated system which moved the whole barrel and slide assembly instead. That makes more sense on a pistol. So that's why with those very few gas-operated pistols that have been successful, they tend to be the ones that are really big and are firing really monstrous cartridges where there's more energy than you really want to use. Gas operation is a way to limit the amount of the gun's energy that's actually being put into the cycling of the action. Have a smaller gas port and only take a little bit of the gas to do the job. So the gas system works better in a ludicrously big handgun than it would in something normal sized or compact. James B says, besides the AR and AK platforms, what current weapons do you think will be remembered as the innovative, proven, and classic firearms of this era? I think in 100 years we'll look back on this era as predominantly variations on the theme of striker-fired polymer-framed pistol and AR-15. Kind of in the same way we look back on the 1920s and 30s as this realm of Mauser rifles, where they're all kind of the same. I mean, they're all very, very similar with minor variations between everyone. And they're not all Mausers, but just like all of the striker-fired polymer-framed pistols, they're not actually the same, but they're all really obviously in the same family. Mausers, Springfields, Arisakas, even the guns that are more substantially different, like Carcanos and Berthier's and Steyr M95s, they're all very clearly still in the same family and very similar to each other. If we go back to another example of that, you could look at the late 1800s and look at European military revolvers, and they're all kind of the same. I know they're not. If you disassemble them, yes, there are various lineages of specific design elements, but from an end user perspective, they're basically all interchangeable, kind of like all the striker-fired pistols are, from an end user perspective, basically interchangeable, as are all of these variations on the AR-15, or in a little bit wider circle, the black rifle in general. So I think that's what will, in 100 years, that's what will seem to be the predominant design of the time we're currently living in. And that may last a long time. I don't know what the next development is going to be. It's going to have to be something relatively fundamental to break us out of this current pattern, because the current pattern of polymer pistols and AR-15s, it's a very highly evolved couple of guns, and they are very efficient and they work very well. And it's going to take more than just some minor tweaking to come up with something that's substantially better. Mike H says, do you believe that the internally suppressed firearms are the next fad, and are they even financially worth it? I think they're definitely have the potential to be the next fad. They are starting to show up more and more. As of when I'm recording this, there is a lot of enthusiasm in the firearms community here in the US for legislation that would deregulate silencers, aka suppressors. If that happens, I think internally or integrally suppressed firearms will absolutely become a big fad. If people can get those without having to go through the time delay and the tax, the paperwork's not that big a deal. It's really more about the wait, which is like 6 months, and the $200 tax, which does absolutely artificially inflate the price of suppressors. If you look to places in Europe where they're not regulated, they're substantially cheaper than they are here in the US because that regulation does allow the price to increase. So yeah, if they get deregulated here in the US, I think there will absolutely be a huge fad. And yes, I think they are actually worth it. Do you necessarily want that for every gun you own? No, not necessarily. Certainly not if you're into historical firearms. You're going to, I'm not interested in finding internally, integrally suppressed Arasaka. That's not historically appropriate or relevant. It's not what I'm looking for in that. But if I'm using a firearm for home defense, I absolutely want that thing suppressed. One of the elements that, I don't know, maybe it's not something people want to talk about, but if you use a firearm inside your home for defense, especially if it's a rifle or shotgun, you're going to immediately do irrevocable damage to your own hearing. It only takes one shot in an enclosed room. That is nasty. Do you want to put on earplugs or ear protection? Yes, maybe. Is it feasible all the time? No. I think a gun that has a built-in silencer, to use the other term, is a fantastic solution. It's going to be a little heavier. Don't really care. Not a big deal for the purposes of a defensive firearm. Yeah, if I could have a pistol on the nightstand, if I could have a Maxim 9 on the nightstand, where I don't even need to worry about my hearing. I don't have to try and make a trade-off between, do I want to protect my hearing for the long term, but maybe not be able to hear an intruder that I know is in the house? If I can take all of that out of the equation and just have a gun that is hearing safe, absolutely. I think that's totally worth it. And if they become unregulated, they're not going to be that much more expensive anyway. There's nothing there's nothing that needs to make a suppressor particularly expensive. A couple $100 should be a no-brainer solution, I think, for a lot of guns. No. And hey, if I can go out in the woods, if I'm going to go hunting, do I want a suppressor? Yeah, of course. Same thing. Do I want to put in earplugs and maybe I won't hear the game that I'm looking for? Do I want to try and make the best of the trip and not obstruct my hearing while I'm trying to stalk, but then accept the fact that I'm going to do hearing damage to myself when I fire? I'd much rather have none of those questions at all and just go straight to having a suppressed firearm. So yes, I think suppressors are worth it to have. I think they'll absolutely be worth it if they get deregulated here in the US. There's a reason why they're very popular in a lot of other countries. Simon W. Has asked this question before, and I haven't addressed it, and I am this month, Simon. Small arms that use the conical bore principle to impart high velocities to projectiles, such as the German SPZB-41, the Schwerpanzerbüchse 41, the heavy anti-tank rifle. What he's talking about here is the idea of a squeeze bore, where a cartridge or a barrel, a bore diameter, will start large and get substantially narrower. For example, the Germans did this with a 28 millimeter that ended up as 20 millimeter. They did it with a 42 that went down to 30 something or 28. I don't remember exactly. The idea here is it allows you to what you're doing is firing a projectile that is light for its bore size and thus goes very fast. With a squeeze bore, the way this is typically done is by having like skirts on the bullet itself. So you're not actually trying to compress a solid block of a bullet from 28 millimeter down to 20. Instead, you're taking these flanges off the side and you're crushing them down against the bullet. That makes it a lot easier to do. Now, the problem with these things is they tend to have very high chamber pressure because you're not just trying to push a bullet down a bullet-sized barrel, you're actually crushing down the bullet in the process. That's going to take a lot more force. As a result, pressure in the chamber is going to build up to a much higher level during this process. This is also going to put a lot more wear on the inside of the barrel. Squeeze bore guns typically have relatively poor service lives. I mean, some of the German anti-tank squeeze bore stuff, you're talking about like a 500 round lifespan of a barrel. In combat, maybe that's not a big deal because if you're using one of these things on the Eastern Front in 44, the chances are probably pretty slim that you'll get 500 rounds off before you get destroyed by something. But this is an issue for militaries that want to train. that want to have guns in supply and train with them on a regular basis. You know, if how good do you want your gunners to be? Okay, they need to fire that much ammunition every year. Well, if you can only put 500 rounds through the gun before you have to replace the barrel, and let's also point out, squeeze bore, tapered barrels are kind of hard to make. Certainly a lot more difficult to make, a lot more expensive to make than a typical cylindrical bore, because you can't just pull a button rifling thing through to get a conical barrel. If you have to replace that barrel every year, maybe every 2 years, maybe every 6 months, depending on what your training regimen is, that gets expensive really fast. The other thing is the squeeze bore. This was typically done for anti-tank weapons, because barrier penetration, you don't really need that much of a hyper velocity penetrating bullet for regular infantry stuff. It just isn't worth the trade-off. It was worth the trade-off for anti-tank rifles, but only during that period when a solid projectile in an anti-tank rifle was effective. And by the end of World War II, hollow charge explosives were far more effective against tanks than bullets, even very high velocity squeeze bore bullets. Now, in the case of Germany, they got rid of a lot of these because making that armor piercing bullet required some kind of exotic materials, things like tungsten that they didn't have very much of. It was a lot more economically viable for them to make hollow charge anti-tank grenades, as well as then not having to make these complex and expensive squeeze bore anti-tank rifles as well. So if you want, actually, here's the other thing that comes up. You don't necessarily have to have a tapered bore in order to get a very high velocity bullet. You can also do it with a sabot. So let's say you have a 50 caliber rifle and you want to be able to fire something at like 4,500 feet per second. That means you have to have a very light bullet. Well, if you make a 50 caliber bullet that light, you end up with this thing it's not bullet shaped, it's not long and tapering. It's now going to be very short, and it's going to have really goofy aerodynamics, may not stabilize well. Instead, what you do is take a smaller diameter projectile, say a 30 caliber bullet, and you put it inside just a soft sabot, like a plastic sabot, so that it now fits in your 50 caliber barrel, has a gas seal. When you fire it, that sabot breaks into two pieces and just falls off as soon as the bullet exits the muzzle. Now you have your light, say 150 grain 30 caliber bullet traveling at some ludicrous velocity out of a 50 caliber rifle that normally would be firing a bullet 6 or 7 times that heavy. So that requires no special barrels, doesn't really put any more wear on the bore than a normal bullet. There are some accuracy issues potentially, depending on the repeatability of the bullet in the sabot and how precisely those are manufactured. But you end up with some accuracy issues from a tapered bore as well, potentially, depending on how reliably those flanges, those skirts on the bullet crush down each time. So tapered bores are just kind of the worst trade-off of all the available ones, and their practical purposes kind of dried up and disappeared, and that's why we don't see them basically at all anymore. You'll notice tank main weapons today tend to fire fin-stabilized sabot encased projectiles. A couple more here. David G says, would the Jager pistol be feasible to replicate with simple machine tools, lathe, milling machine, etc.? And where would one find the blueprints? Are there any other forgotten weapons that would be reasonable for someone looking to produce a project to replicate? Yes, I think the Jager would actually be a pretty good potential project. If you want to build an interesting replica, historical, unusual firearm, the Jager is a good one. If you aren't familiar with the Jager, well, I do have a video on the Jager. In fact, I have a couple of videos on the Jager. It was a World War I German 32 caliber pistol that is interesting and unique for having no solid frame. Instead, it had 2 side plates and a front strap and a back strap, and these all literally pinned and screwed together to create a de facto frame. But because there's no big intricate frame that has to be broached out or milled with complicated processes, you just have 2 flat plates and then 2, a front strap and a back strap that could be clamped and milled pretty easily in a basic machine with basic tooling. yeah, I think that'd be a pretty good project. As for where you would find blueprints, that would be nowhere. As far as I know, there are no surviving existing blueprints for the Jager. Now, I think you could probably get enough information to make one from the couple videos I have. C and Arsenal also has a video, as well as his typical three-dimensional animation. I don't know, maybe he'd be willing to provide someone with some of the 3D models for that. If not, I think a couple good screenshots from his video would allow you to get close enough. It's the kind of thing of, for a project like that, the blueprints are there for industrial production and gauging so that all your parts are interchangeable. If you're making a one-off reproduction, you're going to be hand-fitting that gun anyway, no matter what. So having exact original blueprints is a lot less important. I can't honestly think of a whole lot of guns that are more suitable right off the bat. Jager's a really good idea. It'd be cool. If you do build one, send me pictures. I'd love to see it. Ryan Yu says, what was the purpose of rimmed ammo and why is it not used anymore? That's an easy one. Originally, rimmed ammunition, which is where the case head has this big rim that sticks out beyond the body of the cartridge. That was done because it was easier to manufacture, and that's how the rounds were head spaced. You'd basically stuff it in until the rim hit the base of the face of the chamber, and you're done. Made it simpler to manufacture the chamber itself. Now today, most of our cartridges are head spaced off the shoulder of the cartridge where it necks up like this. The reason we do that is because rimmed cartridges are really problematic for semi-automatic or fully automatic firearms. If you've got that big rim sticking out on the back of the case, it's hard to stack a lot of those cases in a magazine and not have feeding troubles. It can be done, certainly. There are plenty of magazine-fed 7.62x54 caliber weapons. Of course, the Bren gun in 303, the Lee Enfields in 303. These can be done, but you always have to have elements in there to mitigate the potential of rim lock, which is where the rim of one cartridge gets behind the rim of the cartridge below it. So when this one tries to go forward, the cartridge below it interferes and stops it. If it's not that difficult to make a nice precise chamber that head spaces off the shoulder of the cartridge, which it's not anymore, then there's no good reason to retain the rim on the case. So you see rimmed cartridges generally as just technological holdovers on areas where magazines aren't an issue, namely revolvers. And pretty much everything else has gone to rimless, where they're not technically rimless, it's just the rim is the same diameter as the body of the case, and there's an extractor groove cut in between the rim and the body so that you have a place for an extractor to hook onto the rim. And last question for today, Andrew E. says, have you ever had an oh crap moment looking at firearms at the auction houses, springs sent flying across the room, dropped parts, couldn't figure out reassembly, etc.? Yeah, I have. I've yet to ever actually break anything, which I'm very happy about. But I have had a few pucker moments. The one that really comes to mind is a 1904 Webley at the Julia auction house a couple of years ago. This turned out to be, it was some insanely expensive gun. It was like a $50,000 or $60,000 gun, I think it ended up selling for. And one of the cool distinctive features about the Webley automatics is they don't use a coil spring around the barrel or under the barrel. They actually have a V-spring under the grip panel, which is a cool idea. It gets the main spring kind of out of the way of the action. They're neat. There aren't a whole lot of other guns that do that. So that was something I was looking at. And I took the grip panel off, and sure enough, there it is. I'm looking at it, okay. And then I went to flip the gun over to work on the slide and the other grip panel. No big deal. And yes, and then I heard a poing, and the V-spring had sprung itself out of the grip of the gun. Now, one of the issues of the V-spring is they are very stiff. Coil springs are typically pretty easy to compress, and that's why you have a pretty long coil spring to get a lot of energy. A V-spring, I mean, you're talking maybe an inch that compresses down to half an inch, and there are some of those things that are really tricky to get into guns. In fact, there are guns out there where, some of the early Monlikers, I believe, did this, where there's actually a little tool, and when you're taking the gun apart, the tool has a couple little prongs on it, and you cock the action, and then you lock this tool onto the V-spring to keep it compressed and remove spring tension from the rest of the gun, and then you can take it out very carefully held in this tool so that you can replace it without having to recompress it. And I did not have one of those for the Webley, and I was really worried at that point that I might not be able to get that spring assembled back into that gun, which would be really bad. As it turns out, and if I'd been thinking about this a little more clearly, I probably would have realized it, the fact that it was loose enough to fall out without the grip panel being on, it was also loose enough that it wasn't a big deal to put back into the gun, fortunately. But yeah, that was one of the kind of, oh geez, pucker moments. There have been a few others, but none quite like that. The other times that tends to come up are when guns aren't in the greatest condition. It can be difficult to, even if you know how they're supposed to come apart, if parts are worn or there's something bent inside, sometimes you can get something halfway apart, and then it's like, well, it doesn't really want to come the rest of the way out, but it doesn't really want to go back in either, and you kind of have to fight with them. That's happened once or twice. At this point, normally when I get to that level with something, I just stop, because I'd rather not disassemble it than risk actually breaking something. And you'll see that, for example, in the Turner conversion SMLE at Rock Island, where I know how the side plate on that gun is supposed to come off, and I tried a lot of variations, and it just never quite wanted to come off easily, and I didn't want to force it. So that covers it. That was like 20-some questions today, I think. Thank you very much to everyone on Patreon who submitted questions. As always, I got many times more questions than I could possibly answer in one video. So if, like Simon, you've asked your question and I didn't answer it, please ask me again next month, and hopefully we'll be able to get it in that time. If you'd like to have your question in one of these episodes, it's open to everyone who supports me on Patreon. $1 a month goes a really long way to helping me run the channel and keep doing this for you guys. So thank you very much for watching. Tune in again next time for more cool guns on ForgottenWeapons.com.